or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Ron Bickelman, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the July 11th and 12th issues of the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Apple sues OpenAI claiming theft. Apple sued OpenAI and one of its top executives Friday, alleging the AI company stole trade secrets as part of its efforts to develop competing devices. The civil suit filed in Northern District of California accuses OpenAI Chief Hardware Officer Tang Tan and Chang Liu, a member of its technical staff, of taking Apple's confidential information through various methods. Both are former Apple employees who went to work for OpenAI. The lawsuit shows how the relationship between the two companies has deteriorated since 2024, when they signed a deal to have OpenAI ChatGPT work with Apple's Siri chatbot. Apple's new Siri AI, announced in June, is powered by Google's Gemini technology. Tan is leading OpenAI's efforts to develop its own devices, a crucial strategic effort so that the companies can reach consumers directly rather than via other companies' devices such as Apple's iPhone. The suit alleges that Tan emailed himself information about Apple's suppliers that he had directed job candidates still working for Apple to bring actual parts from Apple to their interviews for a show and tell with OpenAI team. The spokesperson for OpenAI said, "We have no interest in other companies' trade secrets. We remain focused on building innovative technology that empowers people everywhere." Tan and Liu could not be reached for comment. Apple accuses Liu of using former colleagues' work computer to access Apple's network, claiming Liu downloaded dozens of Apple's confidential hardware-related files. Liu coached the former colleague whom he was recruiting to join OpenAI on ways to avoid trouble with the security team when copying confidential files, the suit says. Tan spent 24 years at Apple, rising to become a senior executive on its products design team. He worked closely with Johnny Ive, Apple's head of industrial design. Tan left Apple to join Ive's AI device startup IO Projects, which subsequently merged with OpenAI. The suit doesn't name Ive. OpenAI is facing other legal claims, including a trade secret suit brought by IYO, a startup developing a screenless voice-controlled device worn in the ear. The company alleged last year that a former engineer stole files from the company and handed them to Tan, then a senior executive connected to the products. OpenAI has denied any theft of IYO ideas and said its device is different from the startup product. OpenAI has also considered sending a breach of contract notice to Apple this year, alleging that the iPhone maker didn't upload the terms of their 2024 agreement to promote ChatGPT within Siri, according to a person familiar with the matter. Apple didn't respond to the request for comment. Last month, a federal judge in California discussed a lawsuit from Elon Musk's XAI that accused OpenAI of recruiting a former engineer to introduce him to share information about the company's Grok chatbox. New York Times sued Microsoft and OpenAI, accusing the technology companies in 2023 of using its content without permission to create and train their IA products. The Times and other publishers asked a federal judge this week to levy sanctions against OpenAI, saying the company has withheld evidence during the legal proceedings. The Wall Street Journal parent company, News Corp, has a content deal with OpenAI. Democrats' financial problems amp up pressure on party head. Ken Martin took over the Democratic National Committee, promising to rebuild the party from the grassroots up, pulling power out of Washington and into all 50 states. More than a year later, Martin's DNC is struggling. The committee has had difficulty filling its coffers as Republicans amass 2-to-1 cash edge and as Democrats wage battle for the soul of the party. Their national chairman has yet to emerge as a central player. The predicament is in part Martin's own making, according to more than a dozen Democrat operatives. From the start, Martin made clear he wasn't focused on repairing relationships with major donors and party officials who hadn't backed his bid to run for the committee. If those power brokers needed the DNC, he told the allies they would come to him. That approach has come at a cost, just as the party's troubles mount. Its Senate nominee in Maine is being driven from race in a scandal, and Democratic Socialist candidates are knocking off established Democrats in primaries. Against that backdrop, Martin faces growing criticism from some in the party who have said he has failed to broaden the committee's fundraising operations in Republican committees as Republican committees outrace Democrats leading into the midterms. The DNC's financial struggles have heightened concerns within the party, still debating a path forward after its bruising 2024 election loss. The two primary jobs of the Democratic National Committee are one, fundraising, and two, going on every form of media every day and messaging, said Rufus Gifford, the 2024 finance chair for the Biden-Harris Walz. If you cannot do those things as a DNC chair, then you can't do the job effectively. He described the DNC's cash disadvantage as a 10-alarm fire. In interviews, more than a dozen Democrats operatives, including current and former DNC officials, raised questions about Martin's ability to help marshal Democrats beyond November, when the National Committee's role becomes more pronounced heading into the 2028 presidential election. Martin, who declined an interview, defended his grassroots approach in a statement that decried Democrats for running the same playbook cycle after cycle, relying on smaller and smaller margins, only to get locked out of power. Cash disadvantage. The DNC has traditionally played a limited role in midterms when much of the strategizing and spending shifts to candidates in congressional campaign committees. But the committee has spent $7.3 million more this cycle than it has taken in, which includes receipts from $15 million loan in October. At the end of May, the DNC had $18.3 million in debt and $14.9 million in cash, according to its most recent Federal Election Commission filing. The Republican National Committee and its two congressional fundraising arms reported holding $256.10 million in cash for the end of May. That is double that it held by the DNC, as the House and Senate fundraising committees which together reported $126.7 million. The disparity has left some worried that the DNC is ill-prepared to quickly capitalize on recent court rulings that struck down federal limits on how much money political parties can spend in coordination with candidates for public office. A lot of campaign candidates, a lot of races on ground are going to find themselves totally outgunned when it comes to paid media, said Wisconsin Democratic Party Chair Devin Remacher, who supported Martin's opponent in the DNC race. We have to figure out how to make up the difference at a time when many of our donors do not have complete faith in the Democratic Party. Senior DNC officials, several Democrats described the gap as increasingly worrisome, while blaming some of the committee's financial pressures on debt inherited from former Vice President Kamala Harris's unsuccessful presidential campaign. Senior DNC officials said the group has long-standing policy of using credit lines and highlighted that even adjusted for inflation, the amount raised by the DNC since 2025 is greater than during the same period in 2018, when House Democrats won a majority in Trump's first term. A spokesperson added that Martin has raised more money than any other DNC chair who didn't have the White House. Historically, the party out of power fares well in the midterm elections, and some Democrats believe they can benefit from the same dynamic to win the House and possibly the Senate, regardless of the national party's fortunes. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the chamber Democratic leader, and Representative Hakeem Jeffries of New York, the House Democratic leader, both whom backed Martin's rivals to lead the DNC, now have a good relationship with Martin, their offices said, but their aides said Martin, like most DNC chairs, isn't in charge of the midterm effort of leading the strategy. Some party elders defended Martin, blamed the DNC's financial woes on Democratic poor performance in 2024. Ken is a chair in a period when we don't have the White House, so we have to lead the opposition party, said Donna Brazile, former DNC chair. It's not an easy job. Martin's unusual leadership style has allowed strained relationship with some of the party's largest donors to fester. People familiar with the matter said. Democratic mega donors haven't Reid Hoffman and Alexis Soros, who blocked Martin's opponent, haven't donated directly to the DNC this cycle, nor has billionaire George Soros, according to FEC filings. Just because you are a big donor and you are not going to you're not going to have extra influence over the priorities of the DNC, said Chris Corgi, the fellow finance chair. Martin, former chair of the Minnesota Democratic Party, shifted power to the state party chairs and last year announced a revamped 50-state strategy that provides a combined total of $1 million every month in all 57 Democratic states and territory parties. Martin's allies said his critics are largely Washington insiders, unhappy about losing influence over the party. It's not easy bringing change or telling some folks that have been on the DNC consulting gravy train that it's not going to be the way it happens anymore, said Ray Buckley, chairman of the New Hampshire Democratic Party. Reopening wounds. Martin initially declined to make it public, suggesting reopening the party wounds would be a distraction. He relented months later. Martin's handling of the controversy under some scrutiny after an interview he gave to Pod Save America, a broadcast hosted by former Obama administration aides. During the interview, former Obama speechwriter Jon Favreau questioned Martin's move to cut the same size check to Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. territories that don't hold federal elections, as they did to key battleground states such as Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. I'm used to taking the pot shots, a combative Martin responded. I just don't care. Continuing along now, Volkswagen's vast job empires face an unprecedented threat. For decades, Volkswagen's prowess in selling German-engineered cars across the world helped support a growing army of some of the auto industry's best-paid workers back home. Now, the once unshakable business model and the vast workforce it sustained is under threat like never before. The world's second-largest automaker said on Thursday it could cut its lineup of cars by as much as half and further reduce its production capacity as part of the second major overhaul in the last 2 years. The cost reduction plan to date under the agreed programs are not sufficient in the current economic and geopolitical environment, Chief Financial Officer Arno Antilles said. Volkswagen is facing challenges on multiple fronts. Chinese electric vehicles have eroded its business in China, which for years subsidized operations back home. Last year, the company's operating margin fell to 2.8%, the worst performance since 2015 diesel scandal. Chief Executive Oliver Bloom has nonetheless outlined an ambition to achieve a margin of between 8 and 10% by 2030, a level Volkswagen hasn't achieved in 2 decades. While the company's plan implies factory closures and job losses that could run into the tens of thousands, management avoided detailing the potential impact on the workforce, which will have to hash out with labor reps. Labor is unusually powerful at Volkswagen. Union representatives sit on the supervisory board that typically enjoy backing up officials representing 20% stake held by the state of Lower Saxony. A special VW law hands the politicians a veto in major decisions. State officials have already said They would oppose factory closures following the media reports about potential cuts. The union organized protests outside Volkswagen's German plants on Thursday in now a show of muscle. Restructuring in particular is particularly tough for a company where maximizing German employment has long appeared to be a high priority as a traditional corporate goal of maximizing profit. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In the half-decade before its 2015 diesel scandal, when the Chinese economy was booming, the company added more than 200,000 jobs globally in a historic hiring and acquisition spree. Employment peaked in 2023 at 684,000 when the pandemic-era checks and parts of shortages inflated profits across the auto industry. Volkswagen has tried to slim down profits, which profits have dwindled, and struck a deal with unions in late 2024 to shed 35,000 jobs by 2030. And at the company's core operations in Germany, negotiations at Audi, Porsche, and German subsidies brought the total to about 50,000. The two sides also agreed to cut production capacity at German plants, but stopped short of factory closures. But progress in reducing the workforce has been slow, the company relying on early retirement programs and voluntary layoffs to keep peace with the unions. At the end of the year, Volkswagen still employed about 600,000 employers, about one for every 14 cars. Every car is sold. Toyota, the only company similar in scale, employed about 410,000 and sold 11.3 million vehicles, about 28 vehicles per employee. 28 vehicles per employee. The Detroit 3 have sales to staff ratios in the mid-20s. Volkswagen's operational skew toward its home territory is also a challenge. About 43% of the company's workers were in Germany at the end of 2025, compared with 17 of Toyota's in Japan. Germany is an expensive country in which to produce cars is costing more per worker than anywhere else, according to the VDA, the local trade body. Even within Europe, automotive labor costs in the countries such as Portugal, Romania, and Hungary are less than one-third of German levels, according to VDA calculations. Energy is also more expensive in Germany than in many European nations, with the company no longer benefiting from cheap Russian gas. In the wake of the war in Ukraine, power costs are also lower in Spain and Portugal, where Volkswagen has some of the most competitive plants. Volkswagen's Byzantine corporate structure, with 15,000 entities and 12 core brands, added another layer of cost and complexity. After decades of acquisitions under the empire-building bosses who touted the benefits of scale, Volkswagen is both a car maker itself and a holding entity for other brands. A much more knotty setup than its global peers. The company has never integrated its brands it bought. Even Audi, controlled by Volkswagen since 1965 and wholly owned since 2020, maintains its own management board, 20-person supervisory board, and all the trappings of an independent company. Bosses try to limit implications through its projects and shared technology components, but many efforts have added costs and triggered internal battles rather than boosting profits. Notoriously a multi-billion-dollar plan to create a group software business, Cariad delayed the launch of key vehicles, including a new all-vehicle Porsche Macan. The model eventually reached dealerships in 2024 when enthusiasm for electric vehicles was already waning. Porsche wrote down billions of dollars of EV investments last year. Volkswagen has now shrunk Cariad and transferred its critical functions to a new joint venture with US EV maker Rivian. Yet the unit still employs around 4,300 staff in Germany. The company still makes more components than its competitors, which is one reason why it has less employees for each car it sells. While most car makers long ago gave up producing car seats, for example, the German giant continues to make its own through a joint venture in Volkswagen's hometown of Wolfsburg. The company's taste of self-sufficiency extends to making its own sausages for the staff canteen and owning the local soccer club. In a humbling parallel, the team was recently relegated to Germany's top soccer league. Volkswagen's decision to build its own EV business appears to be rooted in local politics as much as economics. Most car makers buy cells and have joint ventures with battery specialists. A new battery plant in Salzgitter, a half hour's drive from Wolfsburg, is located next to the engine plant, and a deliberate equipment shifting in the company's industrial footprint from old technology to a new one. Its presentation describing the transition cited employment as one of the challenges. The battery plant was expected to employ 2,500 staff and only a third of the engine's plant workforce in 2023. Volkswagen has taken some steps to invest major overseas, sometimes at the expense of Germany. Product development jobs have all moved from Wolfsburg to China in a bid to rejuvenate its business there. Efforts are also underway to tidy up the sprawling portfolio. Volkswagen agreed to sell 51% stake in its marine engine business, Everlance, last month for the proceeds of about $8.4 billion. In a sign of the union's power, the deal ruled out compulsory redundancies and site closures in Germany at least until the end of 2030. On Thursday, the company implied there were more deals to come as it sharpens its focus on the core automotive business. Every business model has at some point runs its course, said Philippi Hochus, an analyst at Jefferies. The idea that size alone gives you scale is so 20th century. Continuing along, how Norway created a World Cup monster. When a group of boys from a small town on the coast of Norway began playing for the same youth soccer club, there was no way of knowing where any of them would end up in 20 years. The club was free and open to everyone. The teams cared more about having fun than winning, and barely kept score. Inside a small dome, when they could practice year-round, those Scandinavian winters and darkness, the kids of Bryn FK played without pressure. The volunteer coaches preached a simple philosophy: as many as possible, for as long as possible, and as good as possible. In other words, the least American way possible. But unlike the American method of raising soccer talent, this one actually worked. Of the 40 boys on that club, 35 kept playing from childhood through adulthood. 6 turned pro, 5 were selected for youth national teams, and 1 grew up to be the most intimidating soccer player in the entire world. When Norway stares down England on Saturday with the hopes of rolling into the World Cup semifinals for the first time, the smallest country left in the tournament will be led by the humongous goal machine named Erling Haaland. With his golden ponytail, dry sense of humor, and uncanny ability to pulverize soccer balls, the 6'5" superstar had established himself as a World Cup sensation and Norway's largest ambassador. But the most Norwegian thing about this man from the Fords, who looks and plays like a Viking, is how he was raised as a boy. Haaland grew up in a low-cost, high-participation system of youth sports and couldn't sound any more radical to the American ears. It was always that everybody should play equally and everybody should have fun, former teammate said. Winning matches you as at a young age was not important. The son of former English Premier Pro and champion heptathlete Haaland spent his early years in Bern, his parents' hometown of 14,000 people. As it happens, his playing for Bern Youth Club coincided with one of the most insightful scientific investigations ever published about Norway's sports model. The study of kids who were at the same age for the same community ran for about a decade ago, long before it was obvious that the cohort had produced some great Norwegian soccer players of all time. A sports scientist named Martin Ekstrand had heard about the place that was nurturing talent while keeping everyone happy, so he set out to understand Bern's secrets. He collected data, reviewed practice schedules, interviewed the club's players and coaches, and found an explanation for Halen's success. To perform at the highest level in the most people in competitive sport in the world, you need a mix of beneficial genetic profile, he said, and an environment that is near optimal. The environment of Norway participation matters more than trophies. Norwegians are famously born wearing skis and skates, but 2/3 of the country's boys are wearing soccer boots when they are 11 years old. The nation is so committed to egalitarian ideals of social enjoyment, proper development, and sports for all kids aren't even sorted by talent until they're 13. But then the most precocious Americans are already burning out. Only after Norwegians have supplied a bunch of different sports so they can specialize in one. Holland, for example, also grew up cross-country skiing and playing handball while destroying records in what might have been the best sport of all, long jump. Once he was done flying across the world, the snow, and leaping into sand pits, he finally committed to the sport that was in his blood. His father, Alf Inge, also played at Bern before moving to Nottingham Forest, Leeds, and Manchester City, where Erling now can be found terrorizing defenses across Europe. Back in the 2000s, Holland and Bern kids had organized practices once or twice a week throughout grade school, and the rest of the time they were playing on their own. Even when the formal training ramped up, they developed individual skills before narrowing their focus to positional expertise. The only thing more formative in their development than the club's training structure is its infrastructure. When they were about 5 years old, Bern put up an indoor facility in the middle of town that is always unlocked. The facilities in the middle of town that would always be locked and easily accessible. The timing couldn't have been better. A soccer dome opening in hometown of Erling Haaland when he was a toddler was the equivalent of the Cavern Club opening in Liverpool when the Beatles were teenagers. Haaland and his friends spent every weekend morning on the turf field, partly because they weren't spending weekends in the back of minivans. American teams are constantly dragging parents to tournaments several hours away. All those markets are so deeply Norwegian that the kids might as well swap their orange slices for brown cheese. But now that 1 million people in Norway do care about whether Holland's team wins or loses, the national philosophy hasn't changed. As his youth soccer coach back home in Bern once put it, we don't rate human worth based on whether you are good at kicking a ball. Security concerns sideline Air Force One. A lack of defensive capabilities aboard President Trump's new luxury jet led him to fly home from Turkey aboard an older Air Force One plane this past week after the U.S. officials received Israeli intelligence about a possible plot to kill him, according to U.S. officials. The threat was deemed not to be entirely credible, some of those officials said, but the information combined with Trump's proximity to Iran as hostilities were resuming was enough that the Secret Service, the White House's military office, and the National Security and the National Security were the White House The White House's military office and some national security staff determined Trump's preferred plane, a jet gifted by the Qatar government, was overhauled by the U.S. Air Force, wasn't adequate to fly the president home, the official said. Trump ordered a new militaries on Iran this past week after Iran attacked ships in the Strait of Hormuz. The president flew the newer overhauled jet to attend a North Atlantic Treaty Organization summit in Ankara, Turkey, this past week, but he switched planes en route home, switching to the older version of Air Force One to the UK's before re-onboarding the new plane to fly home to Washington. Trump denied Wednesday there was security concern that prompted the decision to switch planes, insisting that Qatar donated that plane headed to the UK so troops there could see it. When asked whether he was aware of any credible threat from Iran against Air Force One, the president replied that he faces threats all the time and that there's number one on his list, White House Communications Director Stephen Chung, that the luxury plane has been fitted with all high levels of security protocols to ensure the president's safety. A Wall Street Journal reported Thursday that Israelis shared intelligence with the U.S. that it said indicated a fresh Iranian plan to kill President Trump. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The New York Times reported earlier that the Trump flew aboard his older plane as a security precaution. Some U.S. officials said they were concerned that Israel shared intelligence to influence the U.S. decision in making toward a return to all-out war with Iran, noting that one piece of the intelligence in isolation often provides a fragmentary look at a possible threat. Iran, known for targeting Trump, could lead to a more robust military response, officials said. A spokeswoman for Israeli embassy said Israel shares intelligence with the U.S. because of the close partnership between the two countries and not to advocate for a hidden agenda. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office didn't respond to requests for comment. Air Force One Dale White, who oversaw the U.S. military effort to overhaul the Qatar plane into one that could transport the president, said this year that the service didn't take any shortcuts when it comes to security aboard the plane. But the Air Force also said in June that the government made trades on some of the less commonly used mission sets. The precise defensive capabilities of Air Force One are classified, yet jet was gifted to the U.S. by Qatar government last year after Trump complained that the planes he was required to fly in as president were old and small. Former U.S. officials said there are significant engineering challenges to overhauling a plane to be capable enough to carrying a president in threat environments. Frank Kendall, who served as the U.S. Air Force Secretary during the Biden administration, said he would take 3 to 4 years to retrofit the 747 plane with a full suite of defensive capabilities required to keep the president safe. It's a lot of major modifications to the plane. It's not simple, Kendall said. Current and former government officials predict Trump will likely use Qatar plane at less in overseas travel. I would have to expect them to only use it in the United States, so I was a little surprised when he took it to Turkey, Kendall said. The expected Iron Man response and broader conflict with Iran was also a consideration for the plane switch, the officials said. Iran nuclear deal is in doubt, U.S. says. World News. The Trump administration believes that a nuclear deal with Iran is growing increasingly unlikely, senior U.S. officials told reporters on Friday, in a rare acknowledgement that one of the president's core foreign policy goals of capping Tehran's nuclear program might not be achieved through peace talks. The official said Iran should release a statement declaring the Strait of Hormuz is open and that it will stop shooting at ships. One of the officials suggested that there would be serious consequences such a promise wasn't made by Saturday, while others didn't suggest there was a firm deadline. Common questions about whether President Trump is preparing for another shift in strategy after declaring the U.S.-Iran ceasefire over. Among his options would be to resume all-out war to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. He could also sign a deal that falls short of the demands or walk away from the conflict altogether, even though there would leave control of the Strait of Hormuz in question. They violate the agreement every day, they say. They cheat, they kill people, Trump told reporters Saturday. They'll never build a nuclear weapon under our deal, but I don't know if we're going to have a deal. Under the interim peace agreement between the U.S. and Iran, which was signed in June, Iran promised to make arrangements to restore shipping and ensure passage of commercial ships. Iranian hardliners have interrupted the agreement as maintaining control of the strait and firing upon commercial ships. So they didn't realize don't transit along designated routes. The senior U.S. officials said that if Iran can't abide by the agreement, which gave the Iran financial benefits in exchange for reopening the strait, there would be little hope of reaching a more complex deal to dispose of Iran's nuclear material and impose long-term caps on the program. One of the officials said that Iran recently communicated to the U.S. that it was a mistake to shoot at commercial ships and that both sides should continue negotiations. There's also can't be a nuclear deal if Iran fails to hand control of its buried enriched uranium to the U.S., the officials said. Under the interim deal, the two sides have 60 days to reach a final agreement, although that period could be extended. Iran made no explicit promises to scale back its nuclear program in the interim deal, but it did commit to the two sides reaching a satisfactory solution for handling Iran's existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium. The deal also pledged the U.S. and Iran to maintain the status quo on Iran's nuclear work in U.S. sanctions of the period negotiations. The U.S. this past week also reimposed sanctions on Iran that had temporarily allowed to set oil on the open market and bring dollar nominalized revenue home, in addition to resuming military strikes. Officials in Tehran said Tehran's violation of the interim a memorandum of understanding, which lifted financial penalties on both sides, earned a reprimand. The permission follows days of these officials' violation of the interim memorandum of understanding, which had financial penalties of sales, earned a reprimand. Permission follows days of skirmishes in the Strait of Hormuz, which led Trump to order one of the heaviest waves of bombardment in months. Continuing in world news, Iran war shifts against Putin. He isn't giving in. For 4 years, Russia has bet on an outlasting Ukraine in a war of attrition. Now, as Kiev drones inflict growing damage on both Russia's army and oil industry, Moscow is finding out the time isn't necessarily on its side. Vladimir Putin's invasion force is making even smaller gains at the front line, so losses exceed recruitment, and struggling to adapt to Ukraine's drone campaign, pounding its supply routes to its forward positions. Meanwhile, Ukraine's stretch army hasn't buckled as Russia hoped, and even pushing back the invaders in places with small counterattacks. Its increasingly capable armada of drones is causing a fuel crisis in Russians' occupied Crimea and pummeling refineries deep inside Russia. The war is at a turning point, but Where to isn't clear yet. Russia on the back foot for the first time since 2022 might still find a way to respond to Ukraine's advantage in the drone war. Military shifts since last winter are reflected in how the war is seen in Moscow, Kiev, and Washington. President Trump, who last year told Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky that he held no cards, praised the country's ingenuity and its long-range drone capabilities Wednesday in an amicable encounter with the leaders in North Atlantic Treaty Organization summit in Turkey. Some Russian military analysts acknowledge that the country is facing obstacles it's never anticipated when it launched the February 22 invasion. The Russian Federation's general strategic position has deteriorated over the past year. On the ground, the pace of advance is slowing, Ukrainian counterattacks are intensifying, and there are all signs of exhaustion within the Russian armed forces, said Ruslan Pukov, director of Moscow-based Tanks and Center for the Analysis of Strategic Technologies. Russian battlefield casualties have outstripped the new recruitment since last winter, many analysts say, leading to growing speculation that Putin is preparing to order a compulsory mobilization in Ukraine. Confidence has spread within the government, and many tried but still determined military units that the country will survive the war. Ballistic missile strikes are Russia's last major advantage, Zelensky said, calling on the West to send more Patriots. The biggest question is when, if ever, Putin will decide the war is just bringing him diminishing returns and rising costs, so he accepts Kiev's demand for a ceasefire that freezes the current front lines. The Russian leader has continued to repeat maximum war aims, including terrorist concessions by Ukraine and its establishments of Moscow's influence inside the country. But U.S. officials hope Putin might be open to a deal that stops the war in terms of that Kiev can live with this year. Others say the answer is never. Putin is prepared for a protracted war of attrition regardless of the concessions, Pukov said. Russian forces are still advancing in Donetsk region, the focus of their main offensive effort this year, and the infantry are slowly infiltrating the cities of Kostin, Tenikva, as they are from taking it. The big change this year is that previously Russia was inching forward nearly the entire more than 700-mile front line, or at least several factors at once. Now, it's just a matter of now it's more even with both sides advancing in different spaces, said Rob Lee, a military expert in Foreign Policy Research Institute, a Philadelphia think tank. Ukraine's army has found answers to the tactics that Russia has been using since last year, said Lee and Kaufman. Russia has relied on a combination of infantry sneaking through Ukraine's thinly held front line and drones targeting Ukrainian movement behind the lines. But defenders have gotten better at holding their ground and hunting down infiltrators, as well as defending against Russian mid-range devices with layered system of detection, electronic interference, and interceptor drones. Ukrainian army has continued to optimize, whereas the Russian army really hasn't evolved in 2026, Kaufman said. Kiev is conducting its own mid-range drone campaign against Russia's logics behind the front lines. The Russians have to far struggle to adapt, and Ukrainian units have developed new tactics to combine infantry and drones to collect counterattacks. Ukraine's escalating drone and missile strikes have hit Russian refineries and other energy infrastructures from Moscow to St. Petersburg, deep within Siberia, and now satellite imagery and video footage from social media. But Ukraine's property isn't video proof. Isn't enough to force Ukraine to accept the truth. Vladimir Zelensky, the former head of Ukraine's military, wrote in Britain's Telegraph newspaper, the military balance has become one of the mutual denial rather than decisive victory. Kiev faces a test of endurance. Russia continues to fight. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Time is 45 minutes after the hour. White House made fixing Intel its pet project, and it's working. This is the exchange section of the Wall Street Journal Weekend. Tim Cook was under pressure from the White House last summer when he fielded an unusual request. The Apple chief was in Washington, scrambling to persuade the Trump administration to abandon its plan to impose tariffs of 100% on all semiconductor imports, a move that would likely increase the cost of the most important products. Apple eventually won an exemption after committing to invest hundreds of billions of dollars more in the U.S. In this course of their meetings with Cook, President Trump and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick also brought up another American company that troubled chip maker Intel. Trump and Lutnick urged Cook to use Intel's manufacturing plants or fabs to make some of Apple's chips, according to government officials. In one of the most remarkable examples of state capitalism in recent memory, the U.S. government became the chip maker's largest shareholder later that month when it converted $9 billion in federal grants into a 10% stake in the company. Nearly a year later, Trump announced via Truth Social post that Apple would begin using Intel chips made for some of its products, sending Intel shares to record trading highs. I decided to help Intel because we needed to design and build our own chips right here in America, Trump wrote. Apple plans to have Intel make chips for both Mac laptops and iPhones, according to a person familiar with the negotiation. The connection between the tariff talks and a potential deal between Apple and Intel has not been previously reported. Intel shares have more than quadrupled since the Lip-Bu Tang took over as CEO in March, promising to cut spending, reinvigorate its product lines, and attract game-changing customers to its contract manufacturing business as Foundry. The company's stunning resurgence is partly good luck. The AI boom recently entered a new phase that damaged huge quantities of the computer chip known as CPUs, Intel's specialty. But the Trump administration financial and strategic patronage has been the more crucial factor. The administration has taken a hands-on approach to the company, twisting the arms of its major potential customers and partners, including Apple, NVIDIA, and Elon Musk SpaceX, all of which have signed deals with Intel since the government stake was announced. Tan has been visiting Washington about once a month to meet with officials from the Commerce Department. Intel and U.S. government officials said Tan also talks on the phone regularly with Lutnick, updating him on the consumer relations and business conditions. Bill Frenhofer, the veteran semiconductor industry investment banker who serves as the administration's chip czar, is even more in the weeds of Intel's business. He gets a briefing from Chief Financial Officer David Zinsner every quarter, and members of his staff meet regularly with Intel executives in Washington and Santa Clara, California headquarters, keeping tabs on the progress of the new manufacturing technologies. Even the big questions remain about Intel's ability to deliver long-term consistency to consumers and regain the mantle of chip-making innovation the Trump administration's unprecedented involvement in helping steer the strategy of a private sector tech company underscores the power of government to create national champions in strategy and industries. From technology perspective, it really seems like Intel is gaining credibility and confidence, said Jacob Fieldgoys, a senior research analyst at Georgetown University Center for Security and Emerging Technology. One of the largest firms that gave Silicon Valley its name, Intel dominated the global semiconductor industry in the 80s through 2000s, beginning in making chips that powered PCs and early internet eras. The company fell behind during the rise of the mobile internet and ceded ground to rivals, making predecessors for smartphones, data centers, servers, and other devices in recent years. Today, the company consists of two main businesses: its product segment, which designs and sells its own chips, mainly CPUs for personal computers, and its foundries, which manufacture chips both for Intel and other designers. The seed of Intel's government-supported renaissance were planted last summer from Tom Cotton, a conservative U.S. Senator from Arkansas, publicly criticized Tan as being compromised by what he described as uncomfortably close to China. Tan, for decades, had invested in China's tech sector through his venture fund, Walden International, and counted Chinese tech firms and government agencies as customers when he was CEO of Cadence Design Systems, a semiconductor software company. The charm offensive worked. Trump took a liking to Tan, whom he views as a winner, according to people familiar with the president's views. Intel has been left behind, Trump said at the time, and vowed to help the company recover its bearings. The first fruits of Trump's matchmaking appeared in September when NVIDIA announced it would invest $5 billion in Intel to buy its custom data center chips. The Trump administration's heavy hand in deals with Apple, NVIDIA, and others could set a bad precedent, especially if Intel fails to fix its foundry business. And Scott Lincecum, a lawyer who specializes in trade and industry policy at the Libertarian leading Chow Institute. Tan also instituted sweeping changes and made key hires that have helped the company sharpen its focus and instill confidence both internally and among potential partners, according to current and former Intel executives, government officials, and customers. In September, Tan overhauled the Intel's reporting structure and established a new central engineering group, luring Skorvisan Enyavar, a top silicon engineer at Cadence, to consolidate custom chip design efforts under one team. In their meetings with Intel executives, commerce officials who want more chip making in the U.S. soil rather than in Asian countries such as Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and China have expressed keen interest in the foundry business. The administration has also putting Intel to expand capacity at the New Mexico plant that produces what's known as advanced packaging as arrays of smaller chiplets that can be combined to function as a single custom semiconductor, according to government officials. Intel and government both view advanced packaging as the company's best chance to compete new rival Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, the world's biggest fabricator of advanced AI chips, officials said. Tan has been on the hiring spree, poaching executives from competitors, including Samsung and SK Hynix, aimed at making Intel's foundry, which reported a $10.4 billion in operating losses over the past 4 fiscal quarters, one competing with rivals like TSMC. The partnership with the Trump administration and others have provided another benefit: cash. Intel executives say without the immediate infusion of capital that came with the government's conversion of $9 billion in federal grants into equity, along with the $5 billion from NVIDIA and $2 billion from Japanese investment firm SoftBank, injected into Intel in late August. Then the company would have to specifically cut capital expenditures over the past year. Instead, Intel has kept CapEx spending relatively consistent over the past year and shifting spending with TAN's direction. Alphabet, Google's cloud unit, announced in April it was placing a larger order of Intel's Xeon CPUs to power its data centers for the so-called agentic workloads, or the type of computing required by large enterprises using AI tools. Google said it has grown more confident in Intel because of the changes TAN made in how it responds to customer needs and communication requests. When they listen to our feedback and execute against it, that makes us even more excited to partner with them, said Mark Laymeyer, Vice President and General Manager of AI and Computing Infrastructure at Google Cloud in an interview. Now in sports, Norway's World Cup runs aground as Jude Bellingham's England outduels Erling Haaland. There's always going to be a World Cup quarterfinal decided by one man. For weeks now, his game-breaking talent and insatiable appetite for goals has captivated America. He was the teen prodigy destined for greatness, incubated by Borussia Dortmund, who is now playing for one of soccer's leading clubs. Only this time it wasn't the ginormous Viking with the ponytail. Instead, it was England's own talismanic leader, a 23-year-old dynamo named Jude Bellingham, who saved his country's World Cup from embarrassment. His two goals, including one in extra time, helped turn a 1-0 deficit into a 2-1 victory over Norway and put England into its fourth ever semifinal at this tournament. He does it every single match, England's head coach Thomas Tuchel said. World class. Wednesday, the Three Lions are set to run into their oldest nemesis, Argentina, but Tuchel cautioned that his side won't be able to count on another one-man show. We made life very difficult for ourselves today, Tuchel said afterwards. We're in the last four. It's amazing, but I'm not happy with the performance. We were lucky today. They were also lucky that Bellingham happens to be born an Englishman. The Real Madrid player, who once was a teammate of Haaland's in Dortmund, had already played a starring role to put England in this game in the first place. His two goals in the Estadio Azteca carried the Three Lions to a 3-2 victory over Mexico in the round of 16. But he proved on Saturday that he wasn't single-handedly turning the World Cup matches on his own. He has now bagged 8 of 12 international goals at major international tournaments. None of those was as consequential as the one he turned into the corner of Orland Nyland's net in the third minute of extra time to put England in front for good. The Norwegian goalkeeper had fumbled a long-range effort when Bellingham displayed his uncanny instinct for meeting the moment, slamming home the loose ball in front end. The massed ranks with Norway fans in red jersey. Until that point, Norway had frustrated England as much as any opponent this summer. A team that boasted of a pair of English Premier League champions in Arsenal's Martin Osgood and Manchester City's Haaland had figured out precisely how to counter the Three Lions' billion-dollar collection of talent. They defended stoutly while forcing England to work hard for every chance in the heat of the Florida afternoon. And in the first half, despite having almost none of the ball, Norway even took the lead. The goal from Andreas Selderup was classic of the did he really mean it variety in an effort that looked suspiciously like it meant to be a cross, but somehow wound screaming into the top corner of the England net. The Norwegian strike immediately joined the ranks of similarly fishing finishes at the World Cup, from El Morado's goal from the byline in the 1962 final for Brazil to the looping 40-yard free kick from Ronaldo that dropped into the top corner to eliminate England from the tournament in 2002. 6 minutes later, there was no doubt about Bellingham's intentions when he tied the game at 1-1. Receiving a pass from Anthony Gordon in the box, Bellingham took 3 controlled touches, spun into Norwegian defenders and drilled a low finish into the corner. It's pure mentality, and Tuchel said. You can't bottle it up and sell it. But in the second half, England looked every bit like the team.
The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.